Arise, arise, and live again! This is William Dymock-Johnson for RPGaDay 2017, Question 11. What game would you like to see come back from the dead? Well, I've done this late because I think I lost my original one. And I chanced to see Rune Slinger's blog about what he wanted to resurrect. And I remembered that, yes, Renegade Legion. That would make a damn fine RPG today. Because in the battle between good and evil, this one counts. That was their tagline, I seem to remember. And a bit of historical perspective. As it came upon 1987, the 10th anniversary of a certain movie you may have heard of, the people who owned that movie wanted to put out some celebratory products. And since role-playing games were a big thing, they thought, well, let's have a role-playing game. And so, a company which should put out a game system for another licensed product, the one about saucer-shaped spaceships boldly going, I thought they made a bid for their version of a game about the doings in a galaxy far, far away. Alas, Facet did not make the bid. Another company called Western Games also put out a version of that game. You might have heard of that one. D6 Star Wars is one of the big game changers, in my opinion, of the role-playing games industry. A departure from hideously complex games. And to show that you can actually do mechanics and role-playing with very simple systems. But enough about People 1. People Who Lost, FASA, still had these game system ideas and not a license to hang it on. Fortunately, they were employing Michael Stackpole to write a setting for their system. And thus Renegade Legion was born. The battle between the Terran Overlord Government, who were space fascist Nazis who cosplayed as Romans. And that was pretty cool. Space fascist Nazis who cosplay as Romans. That's pretty awesome. They took the place of the Empire. And in the place of the Rebellion was the Commonwealth of Independent Systems, which was oddly prophetic. Lucas probably had seen it and copied it down, and it was reborn in the original setting. But the Commonwealth were their opponents. And they both had two different designs of ships, and, well, the Terran Overlord Government was puppy-kicking evil, and the Commonwealth were enlightened nice guys. But to make it, what gave the game its signature thing was that when the Terran Overlord Government went from Republic to puppy-kicking Imperium fascists, a whole lot of the legions went, screw this for a game of laughs, we're going to fight you guys. And they became known as the titular Renegade Legions. So if you really liked the cool ships, because the bad guys did get all the cool ships, and you wanted to play, both sides wanted to play the cool ships, then they could. They could both play science fiction space war, or science fiction tank war, or science fiction really big ship war, and both have the really cool ships. And so yes, and that is basically Renegade Legion. It's Star Wars as military SF, because in the world of the Renegade Legion, there is the evil Empire, there is the plucky resistance fighters who don't really have a hope, and they fight, and they fight, and they fight, and there is this galactic war going on. And that is it. So that is the game system I'd like to see come back. So, more on Renegade Legion. apart from the cool backstory and all the fun fluff, because it was the late 80s, the age of masses of fluff, the age in which Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, came into their own, before the great need for massive amounts of fluff. Warhammer Fantasy or science fiction was a game of battling armies, and some were called Orcs, some were called Space Marines, some were called Slan, and so on and so on. But in the late 80s they too gained a lot of fluff, a lot of massive writing, and people became fans of the writing because the worlds were immersive. And Renegade Legion was like this. It had massive amounts of intricate detail for what was ostensibly a hex-based war game. And there was a role-playing game attached to it. I can't remember too much about it, but there was some. All the games had some interesting mechanics, some interesting effects. Interceptor, the first game, armor was presented in a 10 by 10 grid, and weapons did different damage profiles. Some weapons, lasers, dove straight into the armor, so they could penetrate very, very well. Other weapons, the mass drivers, the electron cannons, sort of did damage in layers. They did more damage than the lasers, but it was all flat, so it slowly eroded the armor away. And you rolled a d10 to see where your shot hit. And so the dream shot was getting your laser shot in, and then getting one of these planing shots in under it, to go in and under it. Because of the damage profile showed that your armor section wasn't supported by any connecting armor sections to the bottom bit, it fell off. So there was this option to totally window out large sections of armor. That was the exciting attraction of the game. Of course, the problem with this in 1987 was this all had to be done and drawn by hand, especially since, like me, you didn't have ready access to a photocopy of every time you wanted to play a game, so you had to draw out a 10 by 10 grid times 4 for each spaceship, and then fill in the rows that you had as armor. So 20 points of armor would be 2 rows and be quite easily penetrated, but 100 points of armor, which was the maximum, took a lot of work. And so this was a lot of work to do. This was a lot of work to organise. It meant that battles were often very small skirmishes. You never wanted to do a big 6x6 fight unless you had access to a photocopy, because you didn't want to write all those things out. And there was a little intricate damage chart. So when you penetrated the army, you rolled on this little damage navigation thing. So you started off at a point, and then you went round and damaged various subsystems, and the fighter got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and then some results said the fighter blows up. So you could have that magic bullet shot that penetrated the armor and then quickly winded round and made the ship explode. Or, more likely, you would do some damage to the subsystems and the ship would degrade and degrade and degrade and take a few turns to be destroyed. But you always had the option of getting that critical hit. You had a critical system right in there. You had the critical system of trying to crater the armor off. But it was hideously complicated. This is a hideously complicated thing I'm discussing. Roll to hit. Apply. Roll to see where you hit. Apply the damage template. Check to see if there's any cratering happened. Cross it all off. And you had to use the little templates. Or you had to learn what the templates looked like and draw them all in. That was agonising and time-consuming and arg. It was arg. And so that was why the game was never terribly popular. But it was interesting. It was fascinating. It was a wonderful way. As I told Rubensinger in his blog, I put a comment, if you could have an app which did that, if you could just power up your interceptor profiles on your cell phone and just have them there, ship 1, ship 2, ship 3, ship 4, ship in, or whatever, and just apply the damage profiles, have a little dice rolling app to do it, and say, ship has been hit by a mass driver 8, bang, on the left side, bang, hit the button, it does it for you, it shows you, it runs through the critical hit location chart, does everything for you, and then gives you a brief summation of what happened. That would be great. And the other games were also similarly ingenious. Centurion, the tank the Grav Tank combat game had all these different little nifty things for incorporating how Grav tanks fought as compared to track tanks, how shields affected. The Renegade Legion shields had this dynamic that they stopped everything totally, but only if they were under 100 grams. Now, a laser bolt, being composed of photons, is under 100 grams. A mass driver shell that a starfighter carries is under 100 grams. However, in tank combat, a tank shell is over 100 grams. A tank shell went straight through the shields and hit the armor. But lasers did not. And you had different types of tank shells, so more playing with damage profiles, damage plates, and cratering armor and all that stuff. And you also had missiles, but you also had this interesting concept called painting the target. Because the shields did this thing called, shields had a frequency in Renegade Legion, they were called flicker rate. And the higher your flicker rate was, the more they jabbled around and reduced your hit roll chance. But in the ground combat game, you had this concept called painting the target, where you could set it up so that the shields could be negated for the actual firing phase. And so you had a painting phase, and then you had the your actual shooting phase. And if you managed to paint a target, then the shields were no good, and you could laser it, and then try and go for those magic bullet tank shell shots down the laser gaps. And infantry were very, very good at painting tanks. Painting tanks was iffy at best because they still had to get through the shields. But infantry, because there were 6 to 7 guys there, all sitting out there painting lasers and calibrating them and working with an integrated technique combat 62nd century Wonko magic thing, they really could paint tanks. So you had your infantry scurrying around the battlefield, dodging fire, hiding in cover, and popping up and painting the tank targets as their main thing. That's what they did. They assisted the tanks in fighting each other. And that was an excellent mechanic. That was wonderful. That was exciting. That was interesting to do. But it was, at the same time, just like the damage system, hideously cumbersome. Again, with an app, that would be easy to do. You would set it up, and you would say, infantry groups 1 through 6. Here are the surviving troops. You know, this one tries to paint that tank. Blah, 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 blah. They light up these tanks. Your other side lights up these tanks. Hit the lighting. You know, choose your painting targets. Hit the paint button. These targets now have no shields. Roll your dice to hit them. Bam. That'd be a lot faster. And again, but there was that interesting mechanic, the idea that your infantry really counted, that your infantry were important on the battlefield, and they had artillery rules and all the other wonderful fun stuff that you could recreate your futuristic battlefield. And Centurion was the one which looked least like Star Wars because it was grav tanks zooming around. The one other problem with Centurion was the map was far too small. Grav tanks had an average tactical speed of about 10, and the map was only about 15 hexes wide and 20 long. A bit small for what you were dealing with. And you know, you could never get the big tank, so you want a big. So that could be integrated into a game you'd play on a tablet, so you could see your map and you could zoom in and zoom out. That would be great for that. And then there was Leviathan, which was the big capital ships. It was the averaging version of Star Destroyers versus Mon Calamari cruisers, and they still sort of have that lookish to them. They're big triangular diamond ships. They've got fins and things, make them look a bit different so they wouldn't get their asses sued off. But yeah, there was an interesting combat dynamic in Leviathan. You had the monster ships, and the bigger your ship, well, the easier it was to move. A bigger ship always lost initiative to a smaller ship. That was interesting. So, in the game, your destroyers would go first, your frigates would go second, your cruisers would go third. Oh no, it was the other way around. Your battleships, the bigger ships, would move first. The cruisers would move second. The frigates would move third. The destroyers would all move fourth in initiative order, whatever sides you had. So if you had smaller ships, they would always win initiative on bigger ships, because the bigger ships were just slower and a bit more ponderous, and this is how the game reflected it. And for a change, that was a very easy mechanic. You could remember it. My ship is 3 hexes long. It goes before the 4 hex long ships, but it goes after the 4 hex long ships, but before all the little ships. But little ships were of course, weaker than bigger ships. So there was that trade-off thingy there going on. And so it had that interesting mechanic going for it. The other mechanic was the disparity between starfighters, which now exists in hordes, and the capital ship starfighters all went last because they were teeny, and they were introduced into 3 different groups, which did different damage profiles. The biggest group of starfighters were the most durable, but they just fired in rows. They just wore you down column by column, so we still had the damage blocks. The second group of starfighters were a little less durable, but they did damage in columns, in 3 wide columns down into the interior of ships. They could penetrate in, and they did it in a big block, so they could really get in and do some damage. And the teeny tiny squadrons, which died like flies, but should they ever get near the capital ship, they did damage in a single row down their damage right into their damage profile, and could easily get some damage in there. And the squadrons got to choose where their hit went. So if 2 squadrons got at you, you were going to be in for some pain. And that was an interesting dynamic, I think. And, of course, the capital ships had their other dynamic, which was that they fired left and right and broadsides, because it was a game of basically fighting ships. And so they fired broadsides at each other, but they had a spinal mount. They had a big gun out the front. Because it was a big gun which fired a slug thrower out the front. And, of course, as we discussed, ignored shields. And so you were either lining up your shots for your main guns, or you were coordinating your broadsides. And that was interesting. That was an interesting dynamic. Centurion was probably the least fiddly of all the games. That was also the third one that came out, so they'd obviously learned some lessons there. And then they put out the role-playing game, which combined all the interesting fluff that they put in all the other games, and even more fluff. Lots of fluff. Tons of fluff. It was the age of fluff, of course. And they've been interesting. The thing that stands out to me was the main gun of both sides, the slug thrower rifle that everyone carried, had ammo in these blocks. And the block could either fire off a shaving, it had a shaving mode, which fired little slivers, which could be fired rapidly, could do auto-fire, could do all those suppressing fire things, because you would just go bang, 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 and you'd fire these teeny tiny shavings and slivers at the enemy. And you also got lots of them because it was a big block, and you were just shaving off, basically grate, like a cheese grate. You were going like a cheese grate and getting your shots that way. Or you could fire shotgun styles, a block, boom, and take off a block and shoot this hideous big block at the enemy, which could penetrate armor, could do vast amounts of damage, but generally you could only fire one at a time, and also chew through hammer like anything. And so that was an interesting dynamic to have as a personal combat weapon. You had these 2 modes of fire in the standard gun, and what they called, I think, the polymer guns, because they were gas-based polymer guns. But I don't remember ever playing Legionnaire. I remember it because it was all fascinating stuff. So yeah, I would like to see Renegade Legion Reborn, mostly as the space combat games were very good. I remember I converted Renegade Legion was easily, you could convert it over. Well, you definitely could convert it over to Star Wars. You could rig up an X-wing, you could ring up a TIE fighter, you could ring up all the other ships, and you could ring up a bigger than fighter scale ships, because you had rules and interceptor for slightly bigger ships, corvettes and whatever. And the corvettes had interesting shield allocation, weapon allocation rules, which really lent itself to role playing. You could have a crew manning your PC Millennium Falcon space cruiser gross thing, and you'd have someone who could do the orders. You could have someone who fired the weapons. You'd have someone who allocated the shields. You'd have some people who ran around doing damage control. You could have this whole party investment thing going on. And like I said, it worked very well as Star Wars. So I remember modding it for Star Wars very quickly for my Star Wars D6 game, because for all that Star Wars was rather cool, if you're a bunch of grognards, which I belong to, you wanted a bit more meat on the bone when it came to their space combat, and Renegade Legion just had that bit more meat on the bone. It also worked very well as Star Trek, because you had the power allocations, you had the damage controls, you had the laser guns, you had power allocations, and all that other goodness that you want in that sort of cooperative game. You just had to pretend at the scales. Your Enterprise, your Reliance, or your Klingon battle cruisers used the same rules as the little corvettes, and you just pretended that they were this bigger, and that the smaller things running around were shuttles or abouts and whatever's. And that made the game, and that made that game cool. So I remember a friend of mine did a Star Trek mod for it and played it that way. So it was a very applicable system. So bringing that back would be great. And like I said, you could do an app for it. You could app it out, and now all the tedious, fiddly number crunching and placekeeping bits can be handled by an app. And for the group combat things, controlling the larger ships, you could probably do an app for that too. And get someone who have the helm, control your power allocation, blah 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 blah. You get the idea. And that would be fun. That would be fun to put it into a role-playing game, and then attach it to a more modern system, or bring back the old system, or give it a new conversion for things like GURPS or a traveller-based system. Something it would need to be a little more fiddly, a little more crunchy than most modern game systems, because it was a hard. Well, it was still Star Wars in space, but it was a bit harder than Star Wars because there was no Jedi's or no space magics. It was military SF in space, military SF Star Wars version. So yeah, that'd be the game I'd like to bring back and see back, because it had a lot of interesting mechanics that back in the day held it back because the technology wasn't there to support it. But nowadays it is. So I cast Ray's Dead on Renegade Legion. Live again.